Hi everyone, I hope you had a great Easter. While I was sitting at home, I was thinking about some of the places I'd been travelling over the last decade or so to do with my job. And I've been lucky enough to spend a fair bit of time out in the western desert of Australia. It's been quite an extraordinary journey, and over that time I've been lucky enough to work with a lot of Indigenous artists and also non-Indigenous artists. And what really got to me, it's not just about going to specific places, but just the overall feeling of being out in that landscape. And it got me thinking along the lines of, what is it about the spirit of place that is so intrinsic, particularly to Australian landscape painting and Indigenous art, and how does it affect non-Indigenous artists as well? So on the wall here, we were just rummaging around and we found a few bits and pieces that are particular favourites of mine, both as artists but also just works. And I've got a James Drinkwater painting here, an etching by Wenja Napaljari, a watercolour by Mervyn Rabuncha, and also a painting by the great Nurapaya Napanjimpa, otherwise known as Mrs. Bennett. Now, all of these artists have a deep connection to the landscape. James is not an Indigenous artist, he's from Newcastle, north of Sydney, but spending time in the country with him, it's really interesting to see the way he goes about his art practice. He draws little snippets from the landscape and from what he feels in the landscape, so it's not a literal representation, more the feeling of it. And in art terms, we call that a spirit of place, or otherwise known as the genius loci. So this particular work, whilst he's done a lot of painting in the desert, this particular work is from Newcastle, but I see all sorts of connections to that interior landscape that he's done as well, and so he picks up on tones and colours and lines and all sorts of things like that. And it's a very, very beautiful, uplifting and light work. It's also from 2014, which was a really important year for him. It was the first year he was hung in the Wynne Prize, and also the year that he won the Brett Whiteley Travelling Scholarship, which was, a really big moment in his time. This little work up here, which I think relates beautifully to the Drinkwater from a tonal sense, is an etching that was created at a place called the Cleland Hills, which is about 4 hours drive west of Mount Liebig, which is a community in the Western Desert west of Alice Springs. That area, up until recently, has been continuously inhabited for 40,000 years. Most extraordinary place, and we were invited out there by some of the traditional owners. And we walked around and spent time with them. It was a deeply moving experience. And one morning, Wenja sat on a swag with me and worked on a couple of copper plates. And these were little moments telling of her travelling through the landscape with her father, whose name was Shorty Lunkada Jungarai, and he was one of the original Papunya artists. And just having that conversation with her was very, very beautiful. We came back, we printed the works, and then took them back up to Mount Liebig for her to sign, and now they're in the collection of the National Gallery of Australia in their print collection. Very small edition, and there were 4 of them, and I always find that connection. It goes straight back to that moment in time, the crisp morning out in the Cleland Hills. Mervyn's painting, he's a watercolour painter from the Hermannsburg School, and his connection or manner of working really arcs back to the great Albert Namatjira. Albert was recognised as the first Indigenous artist as such from a time before the Western Desert painting movement, and he spent a lot of time painting with Albert's brothers and is connected by family through that area. And he paints out in the West MacDonnell Ranges area, including Palm Valley. This is an area, if you haven't been to it, when you can travel, I would absolutely encourage you to be. Palm Valley, which Albert Namatjira's paintings resonate so deeply with, is such a beautiful oasis in the desert landscape. And what gets me every single time I go out there is I see the change in coloration. So you think about the desert as being all red, but in actual fact there's a lot of green, there's a lot of flowers, there's the mountains on the West MacDonald Ranges turn purple in the afternoon depending on where the sun is. And this information, this visual information, bounces backwards and forwards to you. And the thing about the Indigenous artists, or indeed people like Drinkwater who are out there working away, is that it is so ingrained in their psyche. So Mervyn, Wenger and Mrs. Bennett, whilst they are about places, they are about the essence of a place. And Mrs. Bennett, who I spent a lot of time with, Nurapai Napinjimpa, her connection to the landscape is absolute. She was a lawwoman from right out on the Western Australian border, and this particular site is a place called Punkleberry, which is just north of Docker River. Now that is a waterhole system which works right back into a mountain range, and it's not far from the Gun Barrel Highway, which was a very famous road built in the middle of last century. Now, with her work, incredibly delicate dotting and working on the rock hole system that you see there. There is a video which you can check out, which was created by Dr. Ken McGregor, and a lot of that footage was taken on a couple of the expeditions out into that country, and also just watching her work. And what is incredible about Mrs. Bennett is that when she painted, no two paintings were the same, not ever. They were essentially of the same area, but not everything had a variation to it. So she was very much a true artist, and she would always sing, and she would always talk about the country and the landscape and her connection to it. So here we have the Tali, the sandhills, and these rock holes that of course provided life-giving water. Wandering around that country with her permission, I found the benefit of the water holes, because one day I got stuck up on a mountain ridge and couldn't find my way down. Too many cliffs, and I won't bore you with the details, but eventually finding a water hole, I actually walked into the water hole right up to my mouth and drank for a long time. And at that moment, I understood what it was to understand how to survive in this landscape. It was absolutely ingrained in these artists, in their upbringing, and it's such an important part of it. And their art, and by extension, artists who've worked out there, like James, really get that sense of what it is to be connected to the land, the spirit of the land. So it is something to have a look at and think about, and also for us to, in a very real sense, dream about in this time when we're unable to move around. I hope you're all doing well, and look forward to catching up with you in our next instalment.